In this video, we're going to be discussing the Rebbe Maharash, Rabbi Shmuel Schneerson of Lubavitch. He was born in the year 1834 and he passed away in the year 1882. Let's start with his birth and his family. He was born to his father, the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, as we discussed in the previous video. The Tzemach Tzedek was the third Chabad Rebbe, and the Rebbe Maharash ended up being his successor, was his youngest son. He was born, as we said, in the year 1834. His father had become the Rebbe just a few years earlier. And interestingly enough, he was the only Rebbe, the only Chabad Rebbe, who was born while his father was the Rebbe. So definitely a unique thing. There were other Rebbes who had children when they were the Rebbe, but it was never the one that was their successor. Again, because he was the youngest, it ended up working out like that. And therefore, he never met his grandfather, the Mittler Rebbe, unlike most of his siblings, and even perhaps some of his nephews, as we'll see in a moment. He was born in a new house. Apparently, about a year earlier, there was a fire in Lubavitch, and because even though really there were always fires in Lubavitch, it was a city where they didn't have a fire department, obviously, but also everything was made of wood. There were no brick or steel homes. Everything was made of wood. It burned very, very quickly. Also, they lived close together, as people tend to do in religious Jewish communities. And even though the Tzemach Tzedek's homes were not necessarily damaged so much by the fire, he used it as an opportunity to purchase more land for himself and his family, as his family was now growing and he had married children. So he purchased a new home, and it was middle of being built. And while it was being built, this is when the Rebbe Maharash was born. In Iyar, the second day of Iyar in 1834. And his mother decided she wanted to have the baby in the new house. She went to the new house and she gave birth to him on a. She said, "We should say, I gave birth to you on a sifting bed." Apparently, they had a bed that they used to sift the flour for matzah, and apparently in the new house, it wasn't still under construction. They used it as storage space, and that's where it was stored. So apparently that's the story of his birth. His bris was supposed to be in the morning. Again, the Rebbe had a baby. This is an amazing event. All the Hasidim come, and they're all waiting, and the Rebbe says he's not ready to come. Eventually, his wife sent a messenger like, "Hello, all the Hasidim are waiting. It's getting late in the afternoon." Eventually, late in the afternoon, the Tzemach Tzedek came out, and he spoke to the mother of the child, his wife, about the name, and they went on with the bris. And apparently, somebody heard him say, "Polotsk, the Chevra Kadisha of Polotsk." It's a city in somewhere in Russia. The Chevra Kadisha, the Holy Society, refers to the burial society. They are a holy society, but a lazy society. Somebody heard him say that, and they named the baby Shmuel. Of course, the Rebbe himself was the tzaddik, and they named the baby Shmuel. At the meal, somebody asked, "Who is the baby named for?" "We don't know." One of his sons asked, "I don't know anyone in our family named Shmuel. Perhaps he's named after Shmuel Hanavi, Shmuel the prophet." And he said he's not named after Shmuel Hanavi. And he said that actually he's named after a hidden tzaddik, a water carrier in Polotsk, and that's apparently he was waiting. That person had passed away that day, and he was waiting for this person to be buried. As the custom is, we don't name somebody after somebody until they are buried, as that is Ashkenazi custom to name after people who had passed away. He was waiting for this person to be buried. Apparently, someone else in the town had been passed away that day, who was much more important, according to the Chevra Kadisha, according to the burial society, and therefore it took some time for them to get around to burying this water carrier, who the Rebbe Maharash was named for. Another cryptic thing that he said was, they asked him if he was named after Shmuel Hanavi. He said, "Halavai, like Shmuel Hanavi." Shmuel Hanavi passed away at the age of 54. The Rebbe Maharash did not live to be the age of, passed away at the age of 48. So obviously the Tzemach Tzedek saw that he was not going to have a long life, Another thing that he said, it says that King David says in Tehillim that the days of a man are 70 years or 80 years. And he said that some people only have Bahem. Bahem is the gematria of Bahem is 40, is 49, is 47. In that verse again, it says Bahem Shivim Shona, right? Within them 70 years. So he said that some people only have Bahem with the letters, which means Bahem is 47 plus the letters of Bahem is Beis Hey Mem is 3, so that would be 50. So in other words, some people only have 50. So in other words, he was saying like cryptically that the Rebbe Maharash would not even live to the age of 50. He was born on the second day of Iyar, which is during Spheres Homer. Every day there is a different sphera, a different attribute that we're supposed to work on during this time of Spheres Homer. That his attribute of that day was Tiferes Shebetferes, beauty of beauty. And one time when his son was tested, this young boy Shmuel was tested. They said the teacher was very impressed by him, and he said. The Tzemach Tzedek said, "Why are you so surprised that Tiferes Shebetferes does so well?" So apparently, he was destined for greatness from a young age. He was, like we said, he actually was the youngest child. He had nephews that were older than him. Okay, his father, his oldest son, was born in the lifetime of the Alter Rebbe, and he had nephews, and some of his later would be competition, as we'll talk later, were 4, 5, 6 years older than him. So definitely a unique dynamic. And some of these nephews of his were in his class, who were the same age or a little older than him. And he got sometimes in a little bit of mischief by kind of being dismissive of their of them and their prowess, trying to show like what do you want from me? I'm sitting in class here with a bunch of people who are a bunch of dummies, so to speak. So he also was known to love stories. He loved hanging out with the Hasidim who would come to Lubavitch, and they would tell him stories. And his father very much encouraged that as well. He was very ill as a young man. Apparently, he had some issues with blood circulation. Therefore, the doctor recommended, and his parents helped him do a lot of things with his hands. So he because he had I guess you would call it today maybe some sort of thyroid issue, and he had a slow blood flow. And so the doctors felt that maybe if he will use his fingers a lot, it would help the blood flow get to his fingers better. And therefore he was overweight as well. And eventually as a young man, maybe at the age of 15, he developed leukemia as well, another blood disease. And he lived with that for the rest of his life. So one of the things that actually, because of that, they wanted him to use his fingers, so he actually got into woodworking. And in Lubavitch, they had a chandelier that the Rebbe Maharash had made himself, which was like a 12 candelabra chandelier, very exquisite. I think it was wood chandelier. He made all kinds of trinkets. He also learned Safras to be a scribe. And there are Megillas that are extant till today that were written by the Rebbe Maharash. I believe there are 2 that we know about. He apparently wrote a Megillah, one for each of his children, and we have 2 that exist till today. And as well, there was a small table that he was handcrafted by the Rebbe Maharash, and he eventually somehow it got into the hands of one of his children, who has gifted it to the Lubavitch Rebbe, and it's actually till today it's in the Lubavitch Rebbe's office in 770 Eastern Parkway in Brooklyn. You can, if you go into the Rebbe's office, which is open at certain times, you can see on the side there's a small round table to the side of his desk that was handmade by the Rebbe Maharash, Rabbi Shmuel. He was called Maharash, as we were being referring to him, which stands for Mereinu Harav Shmuel. The Tzemach Tzedek had a practice that he would give all his children and grandchildren, he would give them all names. He would name them, and he would also give them a nickname. He felt that it was inappropriate for the people to be calling the Rebbe's children and the Rebbe's grandchildren by their first name. So even young children would be given acronyms. And like his son was called Maharash. we'll talk about in a future video about the Rebbe Rashab, his brother the Razal. These were all acronyms that were given by the Tzemach Tzedek himself. And that is how he is known until today as the Rebbe Maharash, Marina Harav Shmuel, our teacher, Rabbi Shmuel. He was first married at at that time, the marriageable age was around 14, 15. He was married at about, I believe it was 14, to his niece, one of his brother's daughters. Unfortunately, the Kala became ill during Sheva Brachas, and she never recovered, and she passed away a couple of months, maybe weeks after their wedding. He was very, very broken by this. Again, as a young man, I mean, how else would you expect someone to react to that kind of a tragedy? And his father decided after he had built him his own home, to call his own after being married, he decided to instead build a home for him attached to his own house. And that would actually be his living arrangements for the rest of his father's life. And basically, what ended up happening was his father one time was asked by his mother-in-law, meaning the wife of the Middle Rebbe of the second Chabad Rebbe, Rabbi Dov Ber Schneerson, as we discussed in a previous video. She had a daughter who had two daughters. So this would be the Rebbe Maharash's first cousin, and she said, "Why don't you take one of my granddaughters for a shidduch for your son," meaning my grandson. And the Rebbe Maharash said, the Rebbe that Tzemach Tzedek said, I have offers, for my son. He's a great Talmid Chacham, a prodigy, the Rebbe's son. I have offers and thousands of dollars or rubles, in dowry. What are you offering me? And his mother-in-law says, I can't offer you money. I have no money. But I could offer you is the years that I was married to my husband, the Middle Rebbe. I could give that as the dowry. That schus, that merit that I had to be married to a great tzaddik. And the Tzemach Tzedek said, okay, done. And he ended up choosing actually the younger of the two girls. He asked permission from the older one, and he actually took care of her as well and made sure that she also got a shidduch for his, I guess that would be his niece. And he made sure that she also got a very good shidduch with a Talmid Chacham. And the Rebbe Maharash married Rebbetzin Rivka. And again, they moved into the Tzemach Tzedek's home. And eventually, when the Tzemach Tzedek became ill at the end of his life, and he was mostly bedridden, it was their family, the Rebbe Maharash and his daughters and his wife, who took care after the passing of his mother, who took care of the Tzemach Tzedek physically, taking care of his meals, his health, etc. It also allowed the Tzemach Tzedek ended up making a special learning session where he would teach the Rebbe Maharash Torah in secret at different times of the night that, again, nobody would know because there was a door that went from his home straight into his father's home and he could pass through without anybody noticing. And eventually kind of was being groomed to be his successor. And again, it was something they didn't want the other brothers, he didn't want his other sons to know because obviously that might arouse jealousy. He himself was very humble and pretended like he was basically a businessman. In fact, all his business trips, and he did actually, apparently, he won the lottery a few times in Russia. Again, the Russian lottery wasn't like American lottery where you win hundreds of millions of dollars or tens of millions of dollars. It was a big scam, really, the whole thing. Depending on which parts of which era of Russia, it was like basically a tax that if you paid certain lotteries, you would get benefits. It was a whole rigmarole. So apparently, he won a few times. There's actually they found a pan, a bequest that he had written, that Tzemach Tzedek had written, and he had traveled to the Ohel of either his grandfather or his father-in-law, the Alter Rebbe or the Middle Rebbe. He had written that I want my son should win the lottery, and not even though he himself had also purchased a ticket, not me. Apparently, he used these winnings and he did invest in certain businesses, but again, it was all really a ruse not to show his true colors. Truthfully, he was using his business dealings, all different countries, as a cover for his communal work. His father got him involved in communal work and dealing with decrees that were going on in Russia. So these travels allowed him to do that. He also used later in life. He also used his health issues as a a ruse for travel. So let's just talk a couple stories of him hiding his greatness. One story goes with the Sar Shalom of Belz, the Rebbe of Belz, Rabbi Shalom Rekeach, that one time the Rebbe Maharash visited, and again, incognito, was not coming with any entourage or anything of the like, and right away he noticed him and he said, "You sit next to me, and I want you to give out the leftover food." That was the custom of those Polish Rebbes, and the Rebbe Maharash did not want, and he said, "If you do it, I'll teach you the secrets of all these different things." And I don't know if he ended up doing it or not, but we see that right away he was able to be sought out by another tzaddik. Another story goes that one time that Tzemach Tzedek said a mimer, said a Hasidic discourse, and in the Hasidic discourse, it seemed that he had contradicted some of the writings of the Arizal. So one Chassid decided to go and ask the sons of the Rebbe to discuss with them this passage. And he goes to some of the sons, and they discuss it. And right away, one of them he walks in and he says, "Oh, you must be here because you're worried about the Arizal, right? It was actually the work, as we discussed in previous videos, the work of the Eitz Chaim." He said, "Oh, you're here about the Eitz Chaim?" He says, "Yeah," and they discuss it. He wasn't satisfied with the answer. And he goes to some of the other brothers, and eventually he goes to the Rebbe Maharash. He walks by the Rebbe Maharash's home, and he sees through the window that he's sitting and delving over this passage and the Eitz Chaim that his father, the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, had discussed in a discourse and seemingly had contradicted it. So he knocks on the door. Rabbi Shmuel says, "Wait 1 minute." He comes in and he sees on the table, instead of the Eitz Chaim is gone, instead there are newspapers, stock indexes, all kinds of. It seems he was doing research for business. And he says, "What do you want?" He says, I have a question about the Eitz Chaim. I have a question about this writings of the Arizal." And he says, "What do you want from me? I'm a businessman." He says, "Listen here. I saw you through the window. I saw you were learning the Eitz Chaim. If you don't let me in and we discuss this, I'm going to tell everybody what I just saw." So sure enough, he let him in, and he was very, very impressed by the answer that he gave him. Eventually, his father passed away, as we discussed previously, in 1866. And there was now 4 sons who were fighting over who's going to be the successor. In the beginning, they all stayed in Lubavitch. Eventually, after a few months, they realized that was not possible. The brothers themselves got along very well, but the Hasidim were making a lot of trouble amongst themselves, and there were many different competing, letters and quotes from the previous Rebbe, from the Tzemach Tzedek about who should be the successor. Apparently, there was a letter that the Tzemach Tzedek had written, a will, and he had written in the will that his son, the Rebbe Maharash, Rabbi Shmuel, should sit in his seat, which was a clear indication that he should be the Rebbe. And the Rebbe Maharash wanted very much that his brothers should all stay in Lubavitch and they could somehow coexist. But again, eventually that did not work out, and they all, as we discussed in the previous video, they all went to different locales in the general vicinity, more or less, and it became Chabad Hasidic Rebbes in their own right. Part of the story of this thing was that there was a Din Torah. There was a Torah court case based on the Torah law, and the court case was discussing about the different inheritance issues that they were going through, and part of that was what's going to be with the writings. The Tzemach Tzedek had himself written many original writings. And also at that time, most of the Hasidic works were not printed, so they had writings, and whether they were copies of writings of the previous Rebbes or transcripts of their talks, these were all housed in the Tzemach Tzedek's home and library. And they had a Din Torah, and they had a court case, and they had 3 big rabbis. Again, these were Hasidim, they were not themselves Rebbes. And imagine how awkward it is that you're adjudicating a case of the Rebbe's children, and it was a very, very difficult situation. And the Rebbe Maharash, he had Mesiras Nefesh, he had self-sacrifice, that the Ksavim, that all the writing should stay in Lubavitch, and that's how it was. His brother, the Maharil, started the Kapust branch of Chabad. He had probably the biggest one. Kapust is not far from Lubavitch. Sadly, though, his brother passed away. The Tzemach Tzedek passed away on the 13th day of Nisan, and his brother passed away about 6-7 months later in Cheshvan, following Tishrei, and so he did not last long. He passed away 6 or 7 months after his father. However, his son, who actually was still older um, than the Rebbe Maharash, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman of Kapost, he took over that dynasty. It continued for a few more years, and at that time it was the biggest dynasty amongst all the Chabad branches. Lubavitch was for sure the smallest one. However, the Hasidim of the Lubavitch branch they were dedicated. They loved the Rebbe. They were a very close relationship with the Rebbe. It was, again, it kind of shrunk to a much smaller Hasidus. We discussed how by the Tzemach Tzedek there were hundreds of thousands of Hasidim, and now you're talking a much, much smaller amount. Also at the time, the winds of the Enlightenment in Russia were blowing, and many, many Hasidim and their children unfortunately left Judaism. Many of them went to America and other places, but even in Russia itself, you could say that at that time period, around that time period, 90% of Russian Jewry was religious, and within a few years, it changed that 10% of Russian Jewry was religious. So definitely a very difficult time in Russia. As well, he also was very involved in communal work, as we discussed. One of the things that he was involved with was in the late 1870s, there was an issue where basically the Russian government and the czars, they were going through a very difficult economic time. They decided the best thing to do is let's blame the Jews. So whether it's directly or indirectly, depending on the historian that you ask, either they turned a blind eye to pogroms, or there were some government-funded pogroms, and the Rebbe Maharash fought valiantly to make sure that the Jewish people would be protected as they were citizens of Russia. And he basically, what he did was he went to Germany and France and all these other countries, and he put in the paper there's pogroms against the Jews. And then Jewish bankers who were living in these places said, if the government is not going to protect the Jewish people, we're not going to do business with the czarist government. And eventually they figured out who was behind all this. And they said, and eventually, actually, the Rebbe Maharash himself went and threatened the czarist government, the minister of the interior, whoever it was, and he said, "If you don't do this," he said, "Are you threatening that you're going to tell Jewish capitalists not to do business with us?" And he said, "Absolutely, we're citizens, we deserve protection." Like this, the Rebbe Maharash had a target on his back. However, as we discussed, he was in a previous video about the Tzemach Tzedek, he was a honored citizen for generations, so therefore they couldn't really touch him so directly. It was very hard for them they had a big burden of proof to do that. And again, it would be difficult for them to say like, oh, we are behind, the pogroms. So actually, eventually it did work, and they were able to get some protection for the Jewish people in Russia. Another issue that was happening was there was the army draft was still an issue at that time. And apparently there was an incident in the city of Starodub, which the rabbis over there were Chabad Hasidim. And what they did was they said that apparently they had registered some Jewish boys as having passed away, and they hadn't passed away in order to evade the draft. And basically, they really were trying to go after the Rebbe Maharash himself. However, the Chassid who was the Rav over there in Starodub was Reb Zalman Naimark. He took it all upon himself. When they said, "Are you a Chabad Chassid?" He said, "I was a Chassid of the previous Rebbe who had passed away, the Tzemach Tzedek." And he said, "Sometimes once a year I go to Lubavitch. I go because he's buried there. So I went and I just want to pray at his gravesite. I don't know about any Rebbe Maharash. I'm not involved in that." And which was not true. They were actually communicating this entire time. Even when he was in jail, they communicated, and he basically took the whole thing upon himself. We'll see in a moment. One of the Rebbe Maharash's famous sayings was the Welt sagt, which means the world says that when you can't go around something, when you have a challenge, you try to go around it or under it. And I say lechatchila riber, which means you should always go over the challenge. And this is the way he lived his life. And this, in a way, this idea was even in his lack of being arrested. Like he lived on a higher plane, and he himself wasn't arrested. However, another chassid did pay the price and was in jail for 1 or 2 years for this whole incident in the city of Starodub. He also traveled to France a few times. There was a famous story about a that the Rebbe spoke about a few times, and the previous Rebbe spoke about a few times, the story where the Rebbe Maharash once went to France to a hotel, a casino, and he asked for a big suite, the most expensive suite in the casino available. And he stayed in this room, and he went to the casino, and he saw a young man sitting playing cards, eating meat and drinking wine, which obviously was not kosher. And he taps him on the shoulder and he says, "Young man, eating meat and drinking wine that is not kosher stuffs your heart and mind, to divine service, obviously." And the Rebbe Maharash poured his soul into this conversation with this young man so much that after saying just these few words, he, again, like we said, he was ill most of his life. He felt like he was going to pass out. So he went out of the casino, and he saw there's a bench right next to him. So he kind of collapsed onto this bench, and he didn't realize that it was actually an elevator bench, an elevator chair. In those days, they actually had like a mechanical elevator that they would pull chains and pull you up to the next room. And the truth was, the Rebbe Maharash's room was on that floor. He didn't need to go anywhere, but he didn't realize that this was an elevator chair. And they started picking him up, and he's like, "No, no, no! I'm really exhausted from this conversation." And eventually, this young man found out where the Rebbe Maharash was staying, and he did it full teshuvah. He returned to God and became a Baal Teshuvah, became a returnee to Judaism. So we see how, and again, this was his whole purpose for this trip to France, which is pretty far from Russia, to Paris, was just for this one young man to bring him back to Judaism. He passed away at the age of 48, as we discussed previously. His father had hinted to that already when he was a young man. And his children were very young. His successor, the Rebbe Rashab, his second son, was 20 years old at that time, maybe 21, very, very young. He had a young daughter who was 8 years old. It was a very tragic situation. It was a tremendous histalkos that he had on the 13th day of Tishrei, right before Sukkot. He called in his wife, and he told her basically what's going to happen, and she was very, very upset and very distraught. And he basically he told in all his children, he blessed them. He put a little paper into his pocket watch, and when the how do you say, the piece that ticks, the ticker, however you call it, the hand on the watch, when it hit that paper, at that moment he passed away on the 13th day of Tishrei. And he was buried in Lubavitch next to his father, where he is interred to this day. Couple interesting things about his teachings and his writings. First of all, he kind of started this new trend in Chassidus, in Chassidic discourse. It's called a hemshech. And basically, a hemshech was the idea that you would say a Chassidic discourse, and the next week, instead of saying a Chassidic discourse about a different topic, or more related, let's say, to the parsha or whatever it was, instead he would relate it maybe to the parsha, but it was the same topic, and they would continue for many, many weeks. This was later developed even more by his son, where you have hemshechim, which means these series of discourses that could go on for years, and trying to really discuss one big topic in Kabbalah and Hasidic thought. And this was something that he developed more than his predecessors, this idea of the hemshech. There was also an interesting idea related to his writings, where, again, as we said, Lubavitch had these, the Hasidim of Lubavitch and Kapus and Liadi and Yezhin, they didn't really get along. And apparently the Kapus Hasidim, again, who was actually the bigger in number Hasidus compared to the Lubavitch branch of Chabad, they found out that the Hasidim were going to print a discourses of the Rebbe Maharash. So they went to the printer, and basically they bribed the printer, whatever it was, they somehow intercepted the messenger, and they, instead of printing the discourse of the Rebbe Maharash, they printed the discourses of his father, the Tzemach Tzedek, on the same topics. And they said, and then when it was printed, they said, "Look, you see, the Rebbe Maharash, the Rabbi Shmuel, doesn't know anything. He's just repeating what his father says, and he's forging it and saying in his name." So that was something that happened. Unfortunately, kind of an unfortunate incident. I'm sure there were many more of these kind of situations, but that was a very famous one. It's called the incident of Likutei Torah Gimel Parshiyos, a famous incident that happened with his writings. Another thing that was interesting about his life was a famous nigun that he composed, called it was originally called, I believe it was called Ein Zwei Drei Vier, which means 1, 2, 3, 4. And the Rebbe, the Lubavitch Rebbe, would call it the Lechatchila Ribber Niggin, which means that we try to jump over obstacles that we discussed previously. This was one of his themes of his life that the Rebbe really spoke about and really defined the Rebbe Maharash in this theme. So he called his niggin that theme, and apparently this niggin was related to a Kabbalistic book that in the back of this book, or the end of this book, it had some musical notes that nobody could decipher. And apparently inspired by these notes, I don't know if he was a direct reading of those notes, or it was inspired by that, but definitely he definitely put it on a higher pitch. Again, this idea of higher, being higher than obstacles. It was a higher pitch of these notes, and this niggin was composed Lechatchila Ribber, originally known as Ein Zwei Drei Vier. And the Rebbe Maharash's legacy really revolves around the fact that he led the Jewish people in a very, very difficult time in Tsarist Russia, and he cared for every Jew, for whether it was in Russia, France, or anywhere else. And eventually his teachings became the basis of his son's teachings, and became the basis of which became important in the yeshiva that his son would eventually found, and continued the Chabad dynasty, and this idea of lechatchila ribber, of jumping over obstacles, of viewing the world on a higher plane, is something that is a very important part of Chabad Chassidus to this day. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, comments, something I could have said, should have said, please put it in the comments. We love to get feedback. Please like, subscribe, do whatever you're supposed to do. Keep sharing these videos, so that way we get more people could watch these videos and learn about these important Jewish personalities. Thank you very much. We'll see you in the next video.